Okay, I think we're live now. So thank you everyone for joining this discussion today. My name is Praveen. I'm part of India Labour Solidarity and Professor Sai Baba Study Circle. And sorry, my YouTube was on loud as well, so I had to silence it. So today's discussion is the third session in the discussion we are having around abolition in Indian context. And today's discussion is titled "Who Cares for a Caged Bird?" And we are very delighted that we are joined by Chandni Ganesh. Before we get into the discussion, I'll just give an overview of the organizations involved and about the series, and then we'll move on to Chandni, who will do a 30-minute presentation of the excellent work she's done on this topic. And then we will take a 5-minute break, and then we'll have a open discussion. We encourage people to take part in the discussion. We have some pointed questions that we can use as a reflection for the discussion. So, India Labour Solidarity is one of the organizers, and we are an anti-caste UK-based collective that advocates for solidarities across global labour movements through a focus on workers' rights in India and the UK. And we extend solidarity with people who are resisting colonialism, militarization, as well as the broader aspects of imperialism that perpetuate labor and climate injustices. And Professor Sai Baba Study Circle is another organization which is behind this event today. And this space will advocate Professor Sai Baba's ideas, promote education and support resistance movements. The study circle is not just a political discussion forum or group, but it welcomes a collective movement of students and scholars dedicated to political education and activism. Members are encouraged to take initiative and contribute to the group's efforts, fostering leadership through collective participation. We'll share the links for where you can find our groups in the chat during the discussion. And this series, about abolition in the Indian context, we approach the subject of abolition in Indian context as victims and survivors of the systemic violence of policing. We believe in the broad idea of abolition of policing, that policing causes harm and therefore should be replaced, not reformed. With this thinking in mind, we are organizing these series of events and discussions. Through these, we want to have meaningful conversations about abolition and what it means in Indian context. And we intend to produce material based on this discussion that reflect our critical learning based on these discussions. So, and we'll share the link for the series as well in the chat about the two discussions we had. So moving on to Chandni. Chandni is a researcher who works on caste, gender, and abolition. Her grandparents migrated from Kerala, India to the UAE, where she was born and raised. She earned an MA in Gender and Development at the Institute of Development Studies, University of Sussex. Chandni currently works with Diversity and Ability, a disability support organization based in Brighton, UK. She's also a facilitator with lived experience at the Hank Nunn Institute. In her free time, she writes letters to prisoners and volunteers with refugees in Brighton. And the reason why Chandni is here is that she did an excellent work called "Who Cares for the Caged Bird?" It's a multimedia e-zine that illustrates and analyzes the care work migrant South Asian women perform for the incarcerated loved ones in the UAE. And we'll paste a link of that in the chat as well. And through this e-zine, she conducted extensive interviews and thematic analysis, and this research examines the degrees of freedom in a carceral world and builds the case for abolition. And the prison and its machinations can no longer serve as a mecca of justice. So thank you so much, Chandni, for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Praveen. It was so nice to hear you read some of the actual work that I've written because I don't think I've actually heard anyone read it back to me. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Praveen and Ramu, for making this happen. And of course, to the whole Professor Sai Baba Study Circle and India Labor Solidarity for having me. It means a lot that there's a space to discuss this work. And thank you, everyone who have joined today. It's really meaningful that you are committed to this work as well. And I'm so excited to get to know you more during the discussion that we have later on. Um, so I'm going to keep it quite casual. I don't have a presentation for you. I just wanted to take you through some of the work that I have done, and some of the insights that I've had the privilege of building with other caregivers. Um, Over the next 30 minutes, I'll just cover some of my learnings, and we can then take a short break and have that discussion. And I just also want to take a minute right now to acknowledge that the e-zine really wouldn't have been possible without a really generous grant from the Goethe Institute in New Delhi and Reframe, and my collaborators, Pavitra and Shutirto. Shutirto is here today. My friends and co-conspirators, who some of y'all are here today as well, and of course, the amazing women that I had the privilege of engaging with. Um, in James Baldwin's If Beale Street Could Talk, he writes, I hope that nobody has ever had to look at anybody they love through glass. This was a quote that I remember during my first and sadly only visit to see my mom in prison. I carried my baby brother with me after passing several documentation checks. Um, we actually had a passport made for my brother for this purpose to meet our mom. And I was holding him in my arms, and he placed his then very tiny palm against the glass that separated us from our mom. And on her end, she placed hers where his palm rested. And the glass was way too thick for the warmth of their skin to intermingle, but I that moment is sort of plastered into my mind, and um, it brought to life the sort of tender moments that exist within the carceral state. And so this e-zine was really motivated by my own lived experience of caring for three of my family members who were incarcerated in the UAE, where I was born and raised, as Praveen mentioned. Um, I engaged with a group of women who also cared for their loved ones in not like exactly the same ways, which I thought was really important, that we didn't have the same story because there is no single story of incarceration. And through interviews and phone calls and exchanging images, we built this e-zine together. And I'm just going to take you through some of the thematic areas that we developed. Um, there are 8 thematic areas, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I won't cover all of them today. I've just selected about 4 or 5 of them that we can discuss. And I would be so happy if you do go through the e-zine at a later time and you want to talk about any of the others at any point. But really quickly, a context of UAE for anyone who is unfamiliar. It is one of the nation states in the Gulf, and immigration to the UAE from India is actually the highest. So in 1990, Saudi Arabia had the highest number of Indian-born migrants, apart from Pakistan. But by 2024, the UAE and the USA were the top destinations, each hosting about 17% of Indian immigrants. And the UAE surpassed the US in about the mid 2000s. And I think there is this very glamorized depiction of what the United Arab Emirates is, and specifically Dubai. Um, and this is dichotomized by, the more, um, I would still say reductive explanations of oppression in the UAE, where UAE is either this really big hub for tourists and real estate and this booming economy, or it is this um, very oppressive state that focuses on the deaths of like migrant laborers and so on, which of course is very important and rich. But what we miss in that kind of representation is the daily feminist negotiations that particularly women engage in that context. And of course, this is happening against the backdrop of the ongoing genocide in Sudan, which is being bankrolled by the UAE, as well as a normalization of relations with the apartheid state of Israel. Um, and I think it this easing gave me the opportunity to really zoom in on, of course, a way to think about my own lived experience, but also um, to find the nuances of what these everyday feminist negotiations of care look like in such a carceral state. Um, I'm sure some of you may have read the news of an Indian woman who worked as a domestic worker in the UAE who's recently been executed because she was convicted of killing her employer's baby. And um, interestingly, the employer was also Indian. And I think this very much speaks to the caste power dynamics of the UAE, just because, like Baba Saheb has very rightly said, if Hindus migrate to other parts of the world, caste will become a global problem. And this is very much what we see in the UAE, where caste dynamics and casterality intersect with one another to create this carceral state. And I think the thematic areas that I look at in the e-zine paint a sort of picture of what actually happens when this intersection manifests. And so a couple of the thematic areas I'll take you through are tethering, courts, the dungeon economy, police, wasta, and community. And I will try my best to end on time. Um, so the first chapter I begin with in the e-zine is tethering. And it was really important for me to start with this as the foundation for incarceration, because what some of you may know is that to get to the UAE, you need a visa if you're not a local Emirati. And the visa is the only way that you can get there. And typically, the what happens is a local who has a sponsorship license will sponsor a migrant laborer to come and work in their company. Typically, the sponsor is a man, very rarely a woman, and very rarely anyone other than a local Emirati. And if you look at the gender demographics of this sort of migration to the UAE, what you'll find is that the majority of migrants are men, and men fill out every single um, part. Sorry, was there a question? Okay, I think someone raised their hand. But men fill out every single part of the economy, from the top advisors to local government and sheikhs to the man who washes your car. And it's a very um I would say elite group of people that can bring their family over in this very varied context. And so those who even have caregivers to speak of in the country is a very small minority. So of the people that we spoke to, um, there were women who didn't live in the UAE, but were performing care work from India for their loved ones who were incarcerated in the UAE because they had no means of actually traveling there without a visa. And this does not mean to say that there are no problematics of the women who did live in the UAE, because those who did live there often had to be sponsored on a visa from their husband or father or brother. And that means they are tethered to them. So even if their loved one was incarcerated and they no longer wanted to live in the UAE, or um, they no longer wanted to be with their loved one, they were tethered to them, so they could not escape that. And so the carcerality begins even before someone is imprisoned. Someone is already tethered to another individual through the way that migration works in the UAE. There are, of course, lots of women who travel to the UAE as nurses and teachers, but this forms a smaller minority in the country. And I think this context becomes quite important when we look at how care work unfolds in the country. And moving on to the next thematic area that we looked at, which was the courts. Um, I think when we imagine the court, we see some sort of pillar of justice, as we should, as our policymakers and legislature should uphold. Um, but in the UAE, it appeared that the laws were obfuscated in power dynamics, but quite explicitly so, where in law, it inequality is expressly written out. So all legislation is in Arabic, which makes it very inaccessible to those who are incarcerated as well as those who care for them. And a lot of the caregivers we spoke to actually shared that it felt like there was no law at all, that it was as if we were navigating in a dark room where we kind of just had to feel out how lawyers and judges would feel that day and pass the judgment. So there were lots of caregivers who would go to court, would sit there and wait for a judgment, not understand it, but simply to be there. And they would be asked to fetch a paper from a lawyer. And so, in that hot desert sun, they would catch a bus or walk or hail a very expensive taxi to go from one end of the city to the other in order to get this one piece of paper that didn't really mean anything, but forms a part of the bureaucratic castle process in order to in some distant future, secure their loved one's release. And I think this, to me, when I heard these stories, it was as if the monkey court had come to life. Like everyone was playing a role that didn't actually mean anything. And it's very difficult to secure justice in that context, especially if, for example, you are like many of the women we spoke to, um, lay people who have never had to confront the legislation before, but suddenly overnight you are expected to become an expert. And the women we spoke to did. They did become experts. I think that any of the women could become practicing lawyers in the UAE if anyone other than UAE nationals were allowed to practice law in the country. Um, and then moving on to the next uh, thematic area we looked at was the dungeon economy. There are lots of interesting stories from here. And the concept of the dungeon economy became most vivid to me when I read Mariame Kaba's description of what a dungeon economy is, but that there is this underground, market of transactions that constantly happens, which those in, formal white collar jobs are unaware of. And this happens even outside the prison. But there is also an economy that functions within the prison, especially in the UAE. So a really curious case that um, I honestly don't know if it happens anywhere else in the world apart from the Gulf, is in order to secure a loved one's release, the UAE courts need some form of collateral, which is usually a passport. And the passport is a way to ensure that the person who's been imprisoned does not leave the country without like serving some fine or some other sort of like bureaucratic, punishment that's outside the prison. And when I say passport, I don't refer to the person who's incarcerated, but I mean someone outside who's willing to put their passport and say that I'm going to vouch for this person, I'm not going to leave the country, and I'm going to secure the release. So we spoke to one woman who had gone through a long 3-year process of navigating the law, getting to that final stage of securing her husband's release. And when it got to that final stage, the courts told her, okay, now we need a passport as collateral. And she didn't know who else to ask. So she put her own passport down. And now, even though her husband has passed, she can't leave the country because she has a travel ban placed on her. So that tethering continues even after the care work has technically stopped. And I think this shows that that carcerality is not just a matter of material, a material moment. It is forever, and it transpires in so many ways. Um, and so if you don't put your passport down, you could pay someone else to put their passport down, and each passport is worth a different amount. So at the very bottom, you have Indian passports, and then at the very top, you have Emirati passports. So I think in the global Western world or in the global North, we think of the most powerful passports as, um, you know, Western passports, like European passports. But in the context of the UAE, it's actually um, the Emirati passports that become most valuable. And women would somehow find lakhs of rupees selling property back home or borrowing money from the few friends that they have in order to pay someone to put their passport down. And I think this was the thing that made the dungeon economy most real and visible to me. But of course, there are like other transactions of like having to put money into an account so that the person who's incarcerated can call you over the phone, or if they don't have like the kind of food that they're okay to eat, you would have to buy food in jail or in prison. Um, and I just want people to know that this is a system that happens. Like, I wish more people knew, and I wish more people could investigate this. So I'm hoping that the discussion brings some of this out. Um, Moving on to the next thematic area of police. Um, I think the police everywhere are glorified for preventing harm. But as Praveen correctly explained, police anywhere in the world, especially in the UAE, are not there to prevent harm, but I honestly think they are there to bureaucratize harm. And in that context of UAE, there is very much a marketing propaganda that goes on where the UAE police are glorified to a point where they are superheroes, right? So you can look up videos on YouTube of UAE police like conducting raids, and it's very much like Bollywood style, like going into someone's home, kicking the door down, and it's glorified in such a way that it becomes theatrical. And like, I could never see Indian police having the investment to do this. Surely that if they did, they would create these videos also as propaganda. But the fact that the UAE funnels so much money, not just into um, equipping their police force with all of this high tech equipment and fast cars and all of these things that just make their exploitation of the ordinary individual in the UAE faster and more efficient. But they also funnel thousands of uh, dirhams, which is the local currency in the UAE, into um, this propaganda. And there's no trace of this, right? There's no trace of we spent this much money. But I think if we were able to track that down, we would actually see how much money goes into sustaining this mythological idea of the police as preventing harm. And making that visible is a really important pursuit, which, the caregivers and I tried to do in a small way. Um, And what was really sad was that a lot of the caregivers we spoke to felt quite conflicted about their relationship with police because there was a sense of obedience that they had to embody in order to continue the care work that they performed for their loved ones. In the sense that if they didn't show obedience, they wouldn't be able to talk to their loved ones, they wouldn't be able to have a visit. And there was no ability to resist it. Um, and that, I think that is what differentiates the UAE a lot, where um, anyone needs to show this sort of like subservience, this not just in material ways, but in the performance of it, in order to be delivered what are their so-called rights. Um, And I think that performance becomes really important when we discuss the next thematic area of wasta. Um, I don't know how many of you are familiar with the concept of wasta, um, but it translates loosely to negotiating power. And wasta is very much how things are done in the UAE, where the amount of wasta you have determines how long your loved one might spend in prison, or how much you might have to pay as a fine in court, or how quickly a lawyer will get your case to the judge. Um, and just as it is in any place where social capital deems how much freedom you have, um, wasta becomes this way of monopolizing capital, where the Emirati local has wasta, but perhaps the migrant laborer who has just moved to the UAE has little to no wasta. And it was really, I think, interesting to see how women, over the course of their loved ones' incarceration, would build wasta. So they would make a connection while waiting to speak to a lawyer like in a building of uh, where lawyers sit. And then that connection would lead to another, and they would leverage these connections that they had made strategically as a means of getting getting their shit done. um, and for instance, um, there was one woman who had told us that um, the during the her husband's incarceration, he caught COVID because this happened during the early stages of 2020. And she suddenly stopped receiving phone calls from him, and she wasn't sure why. And this was at the time that lockdowns were being announced, and we had no understanding of what would happen to those in prison who got COVID. And she waited for a couple of weeks and she didn't get a phone call. And so she started to really worry. And she just started calling everyone she knew to find out what was happening, um, what is happening in those prisons, what what protocols are they putting into place. And she had built a connection with a nurse who worked in a government clinic, who also attended to the prison. And she phoned that nurse who worked in the prison and said, "Hey, can you please tell me if my husband is in the clinic? Like, what's going on?" And that nurse went on to find out that her husband had been put into solitary confinement because he had caught COVID. And I think this story is really important because I want to show that wasta is not just a tool of the elite, but women who care for those who are incarcerated have these funny but strategic ways of building wasta as a result of the care work that they have to perform. And wasta is not something that can be only utilized by the local elite, but that um, women who have been um, sort of crushed by the system also build this wasta. And I think this speaks to the daily feminist negotiations that I was referring to. Um, and of course, all of this happens through whisper networks. Nothing is as nothing goes through the correct channels. And I think this is where I want to end on the final thematic area where we look at the community in the context of incarceration. Um, I know something that Praveen says a lot is the um, we need community solutions, not individualization to the challenges that we face today. And of course, lots of activists and community organizers say this. And the challenge with the UAE is that there is no politic as such to speak of. Um, you may have read news of how the UAE government actively quashes dissent in any form. So, migrant workers who are doing platform gig economy work, who demonstrate, are immediately deported, for example. And so, how do you build community in this carceral context where at any moment your ability to stay in the country that you may have stayed in for 20 years of your life, that, like me, who had known no other country, what do you do in that context? How do you build a network? How do you build resistance? And for a lot of the caregivers that we spoke to, even though the kind of care they needed in order to sustain the work that they were doing was community care, to speak to other women who had gone through the same experiences, to share knowledge and insights and strategy, or just for the emotional comfort uh, of a co-conspirator, that simply does not exist because it is actively diluted by the UAE government. But the women that we spoke to persisted in the ways that they could. They formed resilient and, sometimes messy and chaotic whisper networks. They, it is in the glance of knowing, if you walk down the street, you see a friend who has gone through the same experience as you. Um, it is in that shared understanding where community really comes through. And I think that caregivers do this all over the world, but they do it in especially dangerous situations like the UAE, and there's a lot that we can learn from them. If only we look at the sort of we look at this rich knowledge that they have built. Because so much of the time that we spend on talking about incarceration is only about those who are incarcerated, which is an important discussion. But the objective of the prison is not just to break those who are in them, but also to break everyone around the prison as well. And I hope that in the group discussion, we can look at how the prison manifests in your life, even if you've never been to prison or know someone who has. So I want to close here by saying thank you. I've spoken for a very long time now, but it feels really, I think, heartening to know that there is a space to bring this conversation up. And I'm really excited for the group discussion. I think we're going to move into a break now.
Thank you so much, Chandni. Thanks for sharing. There's so much to discuss. So yeah, we will take a 5 minute comfort break and we're back at 10:15, if that's okay. Cool. See you in a second. Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for that sharing, Chandni. I know it's a personal topic for you. Sorry, I can't turn my camera off on for some reason, so I'll try and do it off. But yeah. I mean, I think what you shared is very powerful, as Lake was saying in the chat as well. And I think it gives us some things that we need to discuss as a group and see what we feel about it in the context of uh, abolition in a way. Like, I mean, I think the experiences of your caregiving is very similar to the experiences that my family faced in India, in a way where women are thrust into this role suddenly of navigating through bureaucracy and law and courts and an oppressive police system and inaccessible public transport and all of that, uh, when 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 this happens. And I think it is the role of caregivers is quite a gendered role as well. And we have seen that in other contexts as well, like in India as well. Like when you look at the prison population, it's mostly men who are in prison and the women who are doing the caregiver role. So some food for thought on on what challenges, who faces what types of challenges due to the prison system, and who are incarcerated, not just physically but metaphorically in the society in a way. So I think yeah, thank you for sharing. And I think what you said was about how do you build community when the system is so oppressive is an important one to discuss as well, because I think increasingly the oppressive regimes are learning from each other. As we currently speak in United States, any students, Indian students particularly, but any students who were speaking against the genocide in Gaza are being targeted by the uh, US uh, government with deportations. And I think we'll see the same kind of theme book which will play across geographies in a way. It's not about if it would happen, if it is probably when it would happen in a way. So yeah, I think I don't have answers to it in a way, because I haven't been in those situations. But I think what you have said about how people come together as a community without actually like thinking a bit about a community, but I think this situation forces them to actually act in that way, kind of probably gives us a hint of what needs to happen if we make conscious decision of doing any support work for these people in a way. So you have got some hints and questions, so that could start the discussion. So do you want to put it in chat or ask those questions, and then we anyone can come off mute uh, and talk about what Chandni said, or talk to the topic that Chandni has put. So Chandni, over to you.
I think Lake has a question.
Okay, like sorry, go on.
Mm. Hi, that was a really moving talk. I think uh, just homing in on policing as a prevention of harm or doing harm, I think we need to review that really, because policing is an instrument of state and it is there to enforce what the state wants to happen. So policing, like you rightly said, uh, is glamorized as being the heroes of the community, where in fact they're actually the villains of the community. And we have this notion that they are preventing crime. But in societies where all around the world, they're actually proliferators of crime in terms of, the state crimes, they proliferate. Your I was intrigued really what is happening in the UAE prisons. in a way, it is no different from what is happening in the Indian prisons. Your point about, you know, people from India being incarcerated and have no idea, can't even read Arabic. You know, so how do they interpret the law? Exactly the same thing is happening with the tribals who cannot understand Hindi, let alone read Hindi. And so there's a huge commonality there. But even in the prisons of the United States, where the blacks are incarcerated, you know, even though they might even speak English, but they have no access to law. So it's a huge global problem. And I just want to um, end up by really saying that, you know, this so-called democracies which we live in, India being the largest democracy in the world, they don't care, you know, what happens to the Indian prisoners in the rest of the world. You know, we have just seen the debacle of migrants being shipped back to or flown back to India in shackles and chains, and India's government is just silent. So I think it is a societal issue, and it is a political issue, and how do we tackle that? And we have to tackle that by, I think, really having a good grips of the understanding of the world which we live in. I'll just end there.
Thank you, Lake. I think
And
it's a
perhaps if you can just elaborate a bit on wasta. I didn't quite get what that was about. Please, thank you.
I can. But yeah, I think the prison is the prison everywhere, and the police are the police everywhere. There is no such thing as a compassionate police, no matter what state tries to depict it as such. And I think also something that I really want to talk about is um, the caste dynamics of prison. Um, so the of prison in UAE, especially. I think that uh, if we look at, I did a little bit of research to look at how migration to the UAE actually happens, and a lot of the people who go into blue collar work in the UAE actually come from caste oppressed backgrounds. Um, so there will be an agent who parachutes into their town or their village and says, I have work for you. I'll pay you this much. And then when they go to they go to the UAE, their passport is taken away. They are, peddled into very exploitative labor. And what you'll find is that a lot of people who go into white collar work are Savarna folks who go through chain migration. So their family has found a job there and they've said, come in to do this work. But in UAE prisons, if you could have committed a, a white collar crime and you could be serving your sentence next to someone who has been falsely accused of drug peddling, like one of the caregivers we spoke to, whose brothers was incarcerated for that. And this this dynamic of the Savarna Indian being treated as the oppressed caste prisoner would in India is a sudden reckoning of the loss of privilege and the loss of capital, and how to the state you are just another prisoner. And I really wish someone would fund me to do this research, or fund someone to do this research, because I think that's a really important like nuance to bring to this discourse. But to talk about wasta, there was a cartoon, and I think this is the best depiction that I can offer of what wasta is to someone who's not um, embedded in that context. When I was younger, there was a cartoon that would play on an Arabic channel. So it was in um, Arabic with English subtitles, where a man is in the desert, and I am hoping I'm remembering this correctly, but there is a man in the desert, and he finds a lamp, and the he rubs the lamp, and a genie comes out, and he tells um, the genie, I want, you know, lots of property, lots of money, lots of land. And the genie is like, of course, I'll do that for you. And then the man says, okay, I want lots of wasta. And the genie says to him, that's not possible. And it is that um, depiction of social capital that is um, prevalent to me, that like even someone who could give you every like wealth in all its forms cannot give you wasta. And it's, yeah, originally it started out when the UAE was known as the Trucial States, and when the locals there were nomadic tribes. Wasta was a way of negotiating with um, between tribes. So it was that process. And that process, as the UAE became the UAE, as it was um, colonized by the British, colonized in the sense that the British said, we'll tax you and you can run your nation state how you want to. And then transformed into this like new neoliberal hellhole that it has become now. Wasta has shapeshifted into this way of negotiating social capital, and not just, like negotiating which young people are going to marry from your tribe to another tribe. And um, that shows also how how the advancement of the neoliberal agenda has impacted these otherwise vernacular exchanges. Um, yeah, I don't know if my explanation was very helpful, but I, yeah.
If I don't know whether somebody else wants to comment, but I mean that was really good, and I sort of now understand it in the same sense that a Dalit or somebody from a very low caste can have as much wealth as the next Varna to him, but he doesn't have the same privileges. He doesn't have the same say so in society. So I sort of understand it in that sense. And just coming back to the caste system within the prisons, no amount of constitutional write-up, no amount of procedural write-ups is going to eliminate that. And we see this in the Indian prisons. When you listen to people who have come out of the Indian prisons, that casteism is actually very prevalent and very practiced, and everybody's turning a blind eye to it, and it's a hugely crucial problem to tackle. Thank you very much.
And thanks, Chandni. I think one thing to come back on is that the aspect you said about how people realize about or probably have a reflection about caste when they enter into oppressive systems themselves, where they are oppressed, is an interesting one, because I think there are two ways people generally react. In a way, is that one is acknowledge their privileges in other contexts and start work on that, but or in second ways that I see quite a lot in diaspora is that they completely ignore it, which is a lot worse. Like, is in a personal situation that has happened a few times, is that we do get diaspora people who do a lot of good work on racism, but do not understand the links around how race and caste work in a similar way, and do not acknowledge that in their work. I mean, I mean, for people who are following me on my socials, I'm having an issue with a handle which says South Asians against Black Lives or for Black Lives, and they are talking about all types of systems of oppression and saying how they're all connected, which is good and important work, but they never acknowledge caste in that system in a way. So I think it's an interesting question to say when and how that realization happens. But I do know that Savarna people who happily have a domestic maid whose passports they keep in their lockers, uh, talk about how Emiratis are racist in a way, and not acknowledge how bizarre that all of that is in a way, where you are actually like doing the same thing your employer is probably doing to you in your own house in a way. Good. Has anyone got any comments or thoughts? Because we have put some prompts for discussion in the chat. I can read it out for you. So the prompts are: does the prison manifest in your everyday life? If so, how? How do you define care? And in your view, does it intersect with carcerality? Why and why not? Or how and in what ways? I think let's start with those two questions and then we can go to the other ones.
Uh,
You
I just want to know, Chandni, I understand that you've kept communicate with people who are incarcerated, and I find that very fascinating. And I think, how would you encourage me to communicate with people who are incarcerated, because they do need this communication, and I think there's very little of that is being done. I think, and how would you encourage me to do
So I'm going to give you a very practical thing that you can do, but there are lots of organizations across the world that allow you to write letters to prisoners. That's a really good place to start. Um, like some of my highlights in the month is receiving my responses to my letters back from prisoners. And I think it also shows you that there's a lot of discussion about political prisoners, right? People who have been imprisoned for um, freedom of speech cases, things like that. But I argue that all prisoners are political prisoners because incarceration is political no matter what you are incarcerated for. And I think if you can start by just writing letters to someone who's incarcerated to understand that context, that's a really good place. And I'm like, of course, I don't mean just you. I mean like anyone who's listening or watching. If you're in the UK, the organization that I volunteer with is called Newbridge, and they're actually accepting applications right now for new volunteers. So if that's something you're keen on doing, please do that. Something that happened when I went through the training session for safeguarding is they told me that the number one predictor of whether you end up in prison in the UK is if you come from a broken family. And first of all, I heard that and I was like, who doesn't come from a broken family? Like, please tell me which families are perfect. But also that um, if that is the number one predictor in this country, then how is it not that all prisoners are political prisoners? Because the family is a political space. And so that's also why care work is political. Um, and so, yeah, I think that's a really good place to start. And thank you, Lake, for asking that question. If it's okay, can I respond also to Mansa's question in the chat? Okay, I'm going to take that as yes. Um, so Mansa is an amazing researcher who's just done a lot of field work. And um, Mansa, I'm going to maybe embarrass you and say, like, please share your like contact details, because I think you're an amazing researcher and people should know about all the cool work you're doing. But Mansa asked if I could elaborate on um, my use of creative and visual methodologies, e-zines in this case. And I think, so I would say that the methodology that I was able to deploy with the women I spoke to was not as like creative. Like I would say that it was quite straightforward, just qualitative interviews that lasted honestly like 2.5, 3 hours sometimes. Um, But in those conversations, a lot of the women we spoke to described visual aspects of their care work. So, like what it was like for them to see their husband's watch every day or his glasses every day, but not see him every day. And that felt like a visual reminder of the loss and the pain associated with incarceration, which we tried to depict um, through the e-zine. But also, the reason why I wanted to do an e-zine is because I think a lot of academic work is inaccessible and it doesn't leave room for dreaming, and it doesn't leave room for the very tender and gentle aspects of caring for people, especially those who are incarcerated. And we wanted to make something that could live and be accessed no matter where you are, which is why we did an e-zine rather than a physical zine. And a lot of the work that went into visualizing these stories is to the credit of Pavitra, our amazing um, graphic designer, who read all of the things that we had written, who read all of the interviews and their transcripts, and was able to bring, you know, those visions to life in that very visual way. And I think that shows me that this work would not have been possible alone by myself. Like the work of addressing the oppressions of incarceration is collective work, and we all bring something to decarceralization that helps that cause. And I am very wary of um, like activists who claim that they can do everything, um, because we can't. Everyone has to do something. Okay, Praveen says there's another question.
Is that my question in the chat? I can read it out if you.
Sorry, can you hear me at all?
We can hear you now, Praveen.
Oh, sorry. I was just saying that before we go into the question, I wanted to say what Manasa said about like the context around the question. I think probably Chandni was a bit embarrassed to read that, but I'm going to do that to say that the reason why Mansa asked that question, because she was really struck by how Chandni presented her findings visually in a way that is both engaging and respectful, especially how you avoided aestheticizing the vulnerability of your research collaborators. And it is something they wanted to learn about. Thank you. So, Purvi, yeah, please do read your question. I think that's better. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, and agree on the way you visualize this. It's very beautiful, honestly. Yeah, my question is firstly, just thank you for the talk, and just wanted to see. So we notice a lot of Sarvana people in the diaspora support and uphold systems of white supremacy. The likes of Vivek Ramaswamy, Rishi Sunak, and all of them. Uh, in terms of UAE, do you notice similar patterns, and especially in the prison system, do you see people like involved in businesses and whatnot? Curious, any stats or findings around that? Thank you.
So I can't say I have stats, but I have like qualitative findings. So like I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk, like across this like economic hierarchy that exists in the UAE, you'll see Indians fill every single position from, the top government advisors to the minimum wage worker. And I think each person in that system enacts caste reality in their own way. So um, a lot of Indians who have been born and raised in the UAE learn Arabic and commit themselves to sort of morphing into this like very homogenized cocktail identity of I am Indian, but I speak Arabic. I've been raised in the UAE. I can chameleon my way into an Emirati identity and then work in the police. And this obviously takes a lot of like network building wasta again, and that's what they do. And although Indians cannot practice as lawyers in the UAE, they can do what is one step below, which is like admin work for law firms. And a lot of them continue to um, engage with vulnerable people because they get a quick paycheck out of it. And I think that it's in these like daily interactions that caste reality is upheld. A lot of people try to explain this away by saying everybody needs to make their bread and butter, or everyone deserves to build a living. But I would press us to ask at what cost, um, and who are we harming through that? And I think that is at the heart of abolitionist work, to consider the harm that we do um, to, for in many ways, to survive in this capitalist system. But I think those are two examples that really stick out to me. And then obviously the way Praveen explained how like Savarna, like Savarna employers will keep their domestic workers passports while having the same thing being done to them. And I think also you'll see that the most successful people, or painted to be successful people in the Gulf, come from very privileged Savarna backgrounds, because if we look at who has the ability to migrate into white collar jobs, it is Savarna folks. And they perpetuate the system of this divide between who gets the white collar job versus who gets the blue collar job. And I think that labor is really important, because that's how the UAE um, is built. Um, it is There is that caste divide. Like when we hear about um, a dozen Indian laborers were killed because of poor working conditions in construction, um, do we really think that is a privileged Savarna person going into that work? Typically, no, it's not. Um, and the people who own those construction businesses typically are wealthy Savarna business folks. And I think like having that disaggregated data of migration is so important, but India does not do a caste census. And of course, they will never do a caste census of migratory patterns, because it will prove that the Indian government does not care about its citizens, right? In that they willingly cooperate with nation states and governments that put their citizens at risk in these dangerous occupations because it pads up their coffers. And so I think everyone has this sort of role to play in upholding the carceral system. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
No, it does. Very, very insightful. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
for
you, Chandni.
asking.
So yeah, I mean, I think the next points that we had as points of discussion was, is freedom a spectrum or is it binary? That was the first one, and the other one is it meaningful to distinguish between geographies when discussing carcerality in and in what ways? And I think the final question is, what does abolition mean to you? I think I'll start with the final one in a way, because I did read a book recently. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about abolition in the UK context, and it was written by some of the organizers who are behind, like Southall Black Sister, no, Sisters Uncut, actually. And what they did say was abolition on its own is it's a partial thing which would not give us the liberation that we want. So they say that abolition should always be followed by a revolution, because otherwise you will create a system that will create carcerality, which may not be in the types of prisons that we talk about, but also the prisons in the society, and that Baba Sahib has said before, and Professor Sai Baba has said in his writings recently as well. So I think that is where I think where people should start thinking about, like, okay, like, I mean, if you want to think about abolition in a end-to-end way, you have the next logical step which will come out after it should be a revolution where the existing ways of functioning as a society should be changed, and people should think about collective liberation of all the people involved, not a society which is exploiting the masses in with various tools of oppression they have got, whether it is by birth, as in caste, and in Emirati way, where your privilege is based on where you're born, and if you have the types of passport in a way. So yeah, I think that's my reflection, but I'm happy to hear from you or anyone else, Chandni, in the chat. Or please do come off mute and talk about it.
Yeah, if anyone's open to sharing, I would love to hear how everyone else feels about what abolition means to them.
If I can come in, Praveen.
Yeah, sure, like.
Yeah, I'm reading your website on abolition, and you talk about policing. I'm just wondering whether you're talking about the police as a police institution, or are you talking about policing uh, as a state apparatus controlling? Because state controlling people in favor of the state is not just the police, but there's the judiciary, there's the executives, and the all pillars of society, all pillars of mechanism there. So when you look at it from that broader perspective, the whole system needs to be looked at, and needs to be scrutinized and checked, because what we are finding in India, and elsewhere now, the parliamentary system is being corrupted. Executive is corrupted, and this whole thing about elections. All of a sudden we are now getting super majorities of of parties. Where nobody can bring about any checks and balances. So that the whole concept of the democracies that we live in, it has to be discussed and unfolded really. So whilst this whole system exists, I cannot see any way out other than demolishing it. And the question is, how the hell do we start to on that demolition process? I think some discussions like this are a start, but it's a very, very minimal start. That's what I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm glad you didn't end the sentence on I don't know a way out. Because I think we have to be creative and find that way out. And I really appreciate what you said, Praveen, about abolition as one part of it and revolution as the other. I think Anisha had something to add.
Hi, Chandni. Thank you so much for that lovely, lovely, very personal and very moving presentation of your research. There were two, three things I was sitting with. One is about this idea of how UAE is so very well administrated or policed that there is perfect law and order. This myth. That was one thing I was wondering if you could shine light. And another thing I was thinking about is that there is this idea, especially among Savarnas, about how all of these bad things are happening out there to someone else, not looking at the surveillance that we are under, especially you were talking about the propaganda around the police state and like just the amount of propaganda that the US also creates about police academies. And it's not been doing that, recently, it's been doing it from the 80s. So I'm sitting with the anguish of how do you start that conversation with folks who don't see it. Like Praveen said, like there are two routes that people go, especially because of our lack of education. And yeah, just leave it with that. And yeah, abolition for me, I was thinking it for me it means like showing up in whatever way possible and like putting one's body online. But I feel like the next 4 years with climate change and with the right-wing politics coming to power across the world, abolition would need to have conversations across countries. Yeah, that's what I was sitting with, but I would love to hear from you.
Thank you. I'll try and keep it short because I know that we have to close. But I think on the point of, wow, I'm immediately blank. On your point about how do we engage with people who may not agree? I think everyone has different strategies to do that. I think earlier on, when I was like very social justice warrior about my position on these things, I was so, I think, I was not risk averse and I would engage in conflict. And maybe that was helpful, maybe it wasn't, but I find that often that doesn't work. There also needs to be some buy-in from the other person on the other end, where even if in this conversation there is some conflict, there is disagreement, that conversation continues onto something more sustainable. So, for instance, at my university, I started this anti-caste reading circle, and at first, the lecturers and professors whose curriculums that I was critiquing for not being caste sensitive enough were very dismayed by the fact that I was making these critiques. But by building up that circle, by finding my co-conspirators in that institution, we now have regular, like I would say, like quarterly talks with those in power. Of course, my abolitionist dream is that the institution does not exist in that way at all. But I think it starts with this small change. And I think even as I say this, like I'm like gagging in my mouth a little bit, because like how many times have we been told like you need to take the small steps, change doesn't happen overnight, and like who has to wait for change to happen? It's always those who are at the bottom of um this hierarchy, right? And so I don't know if um it's enough for me to say that like you should take these small steps, but I think building solidarities with people who you trust, like the circle, like I really feel that that's how we build people power, and then we go from there. I'm no expert on this. I just know that this has worked in another context for me. And I have totally forgotten your other question. So if you really want an answer, please like repeat if that's okay. Um, Otherwise, like also very happy to talk to you after the session. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, now you can.
Yes.
Oh, did you not hear anything I said before?
No. I could. I thought it was Anisha speaking, but it wasn't you who said, just said, "Can you hear me?" Okay. Anisha, I think Chandni was saying if you could repeat the other question you had.
I'm aware that it's 10:57, so
Okay, sure.
it's yeah,
You're going to
no
pick it up.
worries.
That's
We
fine.
will
Okay.
catch up. No, but also, Chani, I feel like the way you even speak and engage, there's so much care, and that's yeah, so much to learn and lovely to experience. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for being here. I think that, like you said, just showing up means a lot. And I think that's a form of care too. I was really scared that it was just going to be me, Praveen, and Ramu in a room, but it's so nice that all of you are here. Thank you so much. I'm really, really grateful. Praveen, I don't think we can hear you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, I was just saying, Rama and I are not that scary, even if you were in a room with that. But thank you so much for your time, honesty, and vulnerability in sharing your work, important work. And I think more people should engage with your work and understanding the various aspects of causality and the impact it has. And yeah, I think we'll be happy to continue this conversation and collaboration with you and anyone else in the chat. I put some links on how you can do that. So we are going to continue these discussions around abolition. So please do follow us on our socials if you're interested in this topic. And if you have any other ideas on themes to talk about or people to speak to, please do send them our way. And Chandni, if you want to tell people how they can follow your work, that would be good too.
Yeah, you can follow me on Instagram. I think that's the best way to reach out to me. It's just my name. And I'd love to hear from you all. And really excited to keep engaging with ILS and Professor Sai Baba Study Circle. Um, I think the resources that you all share are really, really valuable, and I learn something new every day. So thank you so much for doing this really important work.
Right. Thank you all. Thanks for joining, and thank you again, Chandni. Jai Bhim and Lal Salam, folks.
Thank you very much. It's been a very, very interesting morning, and have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.